Hey friends, okay, so in this recording, I want to talk about another key piece of research that we're discovering through our nationwide survey that we have done. We've talked about transitions, but I want to take this a bit further in thinking about the experiences that emerging adults had and the way that they perceived them having either awareness or support from faith communities that they were a part of. So let's just talk about this, and I just want to share with you some of our findings as we continue to think about how we support emerging adults and show up where they say they need us the most. So, do churches or faith communities matter to emerging adults, especially in these spaces of transition? As much as we say we need to go there and show up in the places where they say they need us the most, um, we've got to believe that the emerging adults that shared with us their transition experiences had probably some good and not so good experiences working through this transition in their relationship with their faith communities. And here's what we discovered. We asked emerging adults, when you went through a particular transition that you raised in this survey, was your faith community aware that you were going through it? And here's what we found. We found that about 46% said, emerging adults said, yeah, I don't think my faith community, my church, my parish was aware of it. Another 45% said, yeah, they were. And then there was about 9% saying they weren't sure, which totally makes sense. This is pretty classic sort of survey data, right? So basically speaking, as these 1,000+ emerging adults who are Christian and said that they went through a unique transition experience, half said my faith community wasn't aware of it. The other half said, yeah, they were aware of it. Okay. Now, there's lots of reasons for that, right? There could be tons of reasons for that, but I think that it's just a really interesting finding. As we looked at that, then we said, well, okay, so what was that like for you? And what we did is, in part of the survey, we asked them about how they felt about their transition. Okay. What was transition like? What emotions kind of did it conjure up for you? What do you remember, right? And what we discovered is that there were desirable emotions and undesirable emotions. Now, emotions aren't good or bad, right? Like emotions are emotions, and there's reasons that we have all types of emotions, right? But when I talk about like desirable and undesirable, I'm just saying that most of the time we don't want to feel anxious. We want to feel inspired, right? And so we tried to like look at these emotions, and here's what we discovered: that when it came to the non-desirable emotions, the most prevalent were anxiety, loneliness, and sadness. Okay, but notice also what this graph shows. It seems as though that these emotions were experienced more strongly and more often. Well, I wouldn't say more often, more strongly for those who said that their faith community was not aware of their transition. And you can see this across the board, right? Like the difference between not aware and aware. You can see that something seems to happen that when an emerging adult perceives that their church is aware of what they are going through, their less desirable emotions seem to be governed a bit more. Interesting, right? I think it is. Now, what about the other way? What about favorable emotions, right? Or desirable emotions, right? Well, we see here that some of the highest were happiness and hope and excitement, right? But notice again that when those emerging adults who said that their faith communities, their parishes, their churches were aware of what they were going through, that they actually scored higher on happiness and hope and excitement, and really across the board, contentment and is about equal. But you can see, pretty interesting, right? So there seems to be some sort of effect that has on emerging adults. So maybe a way to think about this is like when we think about awareness, like when emerging adults said that churches and faith communities were not aware, that their highest emotions were anxiousness, loneliness, and fear. But for those that their churches were aware of what they were going through, the highest emotions were anxiousness, hope, and fear. Now, anxiousness is still there, and I think that just comes with transition, right? But notice that hope is somehow has replaced loneliness, and I think that's incredibly good news. So there's lots of ways to think about this, and there's more to dig into. But perhaps something we can say here is this: is like faith communities matter in some sort of way. Like this should give us a tremendous amount of hope when we think about that. Now, let me take this a bit further. Like just to be aware is great, but that's not necessarily always good, right? So we asked emerging adults from the survey, like if your church was aware of what you were going through, were they supportive or unsupportive? Like, great question, right? Like I could be aware and just not be very supportive, right? Or I could be aware and be supportive. What's interesting is this, is that emerging adults said that of those churches that were aware of their transition, remember that's about 50% of the population of the sample, 90% of that half, so 90% of those who were supportive were aware. Emerging adults said that they were supportive. I think that that's great news. That somehow this awareness, the majority of churches who are aware of what emerging adults are going through, emerging adults somehow, some way feel and experience a sense of support. Pretty great news, huh? I mean, this is pretty sweet, I think. So let's take that further. When we think about the supportive and unsupportive, again, you're not going to be surprised by this, the less desirable emotions, we see that, remember, these are, all these churches are aware of what's going on. But it looks as though that when a church is aware but unsupportive, the feelings of anxiety, sadness, fear, etc., loneliness, are experienced much higher than those who say my church was supportive. It seems as again that this is somehow governed. Same the other way. Look at this again. You'll see that when emerging adults feel that these aware churches are also supportive, that they score higher on happiness, hope, excitement, relief. Pretty similar with contentment and then energy, right? I think that's pretty cool. It seems as though that emerging adults' awareness and perceptions of awareness and support from their faith communities makes a difference. Okay, so that's pretty cool. So, do churches and faith communities matter? Yes. Now, when we presented this to a bunch of ministry leaders, they were pretty excited about it. But here was the follow-up question. You know what it's going to be, right? Well, how? Like, what does that mean? What does awareness look like? What does support look like? Give us some examples so that we can do it, right? Like, what does this mean? So that we took that very seriously, and when we did not only our nationwide survey, we followed up with 34 interviews from that population that took the survey, and these were in-depth interviews that we did. We pressed on this a little bit and asked them, so what did awareness and support look like? And here's what we discovered. And again, this is still pretty hot off the press. We're still trying to figure it out, but here's some things that we noticed. When it came to awareness, this is what we've discovered, that people within the church knew of the transition that the emerging adult was going through, which could have come out naturally through social media or because a young adult reached out for support. Okay, so think about that for a second. Like somehow social media, maybe there was some sort of online connection and the church or someone in the church was aware what the emerging adult was going through. Or the young adult reached out, right? An emerging adult took an initiative to tell the church that they were going through something, right? Which is agency, and we would expect that. And then there was also something really interesting that, I just call participation overlap, right? There was an awareness that emerged through participation with ministry-oriented experiences where all of a sudden it became to light that an emerging adult was going through this transition, right? So likely they were connected with a small group or they were connected with a church ministry. And so because of that relational connection to something with the church, it became somebody within that serendipitous connection became aware of this transition that they were going through. Okay, so that's the way that awareness was thought about. Here's just some things to think about on top of that. So that's awareness, but what about support? Well, here's what we determined as the support, that young adults appreciated personal and specific support from church leadership and members, whether through conversation, a note, recognition of a loss, relationally based programming, or friendships. Okay, now let me give you some examples of this. I'm gonna give you some quotes. Here's some places where I'm gonna probably read through these rather quickly, but this would be a chance for you to go back and maybe pause the video and actually take some of these quotes in. We realize that perhaps when it comes to young adults' experiences, support for them is when someone's available for connection. So here's the story of a woman who moved to from another part of the country, and she felt this deep sense of connection when people said, "Hey, call, call if you need anything. I'm here. Um, uh, let me take your number. If you want to get connected, you can," right? There's this desire to say, I'm available for connection. And then she says this, so they were there if I needed anything. And I was like, okay. And I felt comforted. Okay. So somehow this emerging adult felt like because someone reached out and made themselves available for connection, that in and of itself seemed to feel like support. We also saw that support is seeing young adults for who they can be. So this is a story of a guy that was going through a difficult time. He connected with a parish, and kind of got connected with a priest who like really got a chance to talk with him about things that were going on in his life. But then he says this at the end. He says, and sometimes this priest would call me a saint, and I never understood why, because I was like, what makes you think I'm a saint? I just think this is beautiful, right? I mean, this is an example of someone from a faith community, in this case, a priest, not focusing on a young adult as a problem to be fixed, but calling out their image bearingness in such a way that they would look at this emerging adult and say, "Hey, hey, saint, I see you. This is who I see you to be." And it seems to have a tremendous effect on this emerging adult to actually be called something that perhaps that they aspire toward. That was beautiful. Also, support is action, okay? Again, this is another example where this individual, their grandfather died, and the church reached out to them, sending them a sympathy card. But then they said this: I can't really point to any other thing else that it's concrete. But I assume that they were always praying for me, and that they always kind of had my back, whether I see it or whether I saw it or not. And I find it interesting that somehow this gesture of acknowledging this loss in this emerging adult's life had an effect where they not only appreciated the act, but it seemed to have a ripple effect where they were like, wow, not only did they send this to me, but I think that they actually perpetually care about me. And they're praying for me. And this was really, really meaningful to an emerging adult. They talked about support as friendship. Like there was something about these communities where they felt like God surrounded them with great people to connect with, or friends that helped them continue to grow and develop and as well. Now, what's non-support? Well, this is where they gave examples of where they didn't feel like support. And in this example, I'll just give a couple and then a category, but I just find this interesting. I wish I could talk to my pastor more, other people more, but pastors, they're real busy, right? Is that the mentality that emerging adults have of like religious types? Like, I know you're really busy, right? Like, that's probably why you've heard me say before, even in this class, like, don't ever say to me, Dr. Argue, can I meet with you? I know you're really busy. I don't ever want you to say that. I want you to always feel like you have time. Like I always have time for you, right? So I found that really interesting. And that's coupled with this rest of this quote. And this really gets to the idea, like non-support is knowing but not acting. So this quote talks about like this person like said, like my community knew that something was going on and they didn't do anything about it. So look what they say here. But there was some sense that they probably knew of my struggles, or they definitely knew, but weren't or didn't, but I didn't hear from them. Okay, so interesting, isn't it? Like they know of what I'm going through, but you didn't do anything, right? And I think that feels like non-support to them. Non-support is being abandoned. So this particular person felt like they made some decisions, some bad things happened in their lives, and so their faith community basically shunned him, and they felt quite abandoned from that as well. And non-support is only valuing programmatic friendship. I found this really interesting. So here's an example of where this person was going through a rough time, but it seems as though people were only interested in them when they were at the program. Apart from that, there wasn't seen to be a pursuit or interest. So let's see the last part of this quote. They would just be like, well, where have you been? Instead of taking time to cultivate friendship outside the events, if that makes sense. So here again is an example of like sometimes I think we say this and we don't mean anything by it. Like if we don't see someone for a while and then they show up at an event or something that we're doing, we're like, the first thing we say is, where have you been? That actually can be really, really hurtful because it's like, do you only think of me when we're in this space? What about other spaces? Why didn't you reach out to me if you really cared where I had been, et cetera, et cetera? So here's an example of where the program of a ministry could be really helpful in gathering peer relationships. But if it's only the program, this has a negative effect, according to some emerging adults. So let's think about this for a second. Like as we think about young adults or emerging adults, perceptions of awareness and support, maybe here's some things to consider. First of all, can you relate to any of these? I think this is where we can evoke our empathy again. Also, how might young adult ministry programming foster awareness and support that goes beyond the programming, right? Like that seems to be important. And how might faith communities reimagine their role with young adults so that they do not become program-centered rather than emerging adult-centered, right? It seems as though to be emerging adult-centered, to show up where emerging adults need us the most, means that we have to look beyond whatever programming we do to see the whole person and recognize that their life and stories spill in and spill out of some of the episodic programs that perhaps churches hope to design or have or whatever it might be. So I just wanted to share with you some of the emerging findings that we have about the way that emerging adults experience faith community awareness and support. And perhaps that gives us some new language and some new things to think about as we begin to think about not only the transitions of emerging adults, the spiritual lives of emerging adults, the in-motion lives of emerging adults, but also how do we begin to think about how do we step into those spaces with awareness and support and care for them. Hope that was helpful.